Hi, I'm Mike Hammond, host of Detective Story with Mike Hammond YouTube channel and podcast. I'm a retired homicide detective with Chicago Police Department. I served the Chicago Police Department for 22 years, the last 16 of which were as a homicide detective. I worked in a cold case homicide unit for several years, the Chicago Police Department. And my podcast, YouTube channel, is really designed around that. It's really victim focused. We always try and keep it about the victims' families as much as possible. We do some interviews with some people I worked with, other cool people that are related to the subject matter. I hope you'll check that out. Today I'm taking a side road a little bit here to do something different, hopefully have some fun, do something informative. This is a little lighter and just food for thought, maybe some investigative material here. And what I've done in the spirit of March Madness and bracketology is create my own bracket of criminals that had an effect on law enforcement and the way we do business. I want this to be interactive. These are all my opinions. These people are chosen by me. So I'll miss some people that you're going to think, well, where's this person, whatever. Let me know. I want to know about that. And after this kind of first round, where I'm going to break it down a little bit myself, we're going to go based on your input as to who moves on through this. So what I've done here is create 4 different brackets. I'll put this graphic up here so you can see. And each bracket represents kind of a different type of criminal behavior. There's some bleed over. There's some people that are missing, as I talked about. In my head, I struggled with a few, like I'm a West Side Chicago copper, so I was very tempted to put Willie Lloyd in there because Willie Lloyd was a very, and turn off your phone while you're recording. That's the professional thing to do. Sorry. In the end, Willie Lloyd wasn't as influential as some of these other people that I've chosen. Another guy I thought about was Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore's story always stuck in my craw. You know, a great book written about him, The Executioner's Song, which was made into a movie. Young Tommy Lee Jones did a great job in that. Gary Gilmore always struck me as a guy that was a real hardcore criminal. Even the way he went out did influence the way we do business, because he made us all kind of look at, the death penalty and how it's administered, because Gary Gilmore had the opportunity to choose his execution style, and he chose firing squad, and is very infamous for his last words. When asked if you have any final words, he said, "Let's do it." He was not a mess around guy, obviously, but Gary didn't make the cut. And so I'd like to hear from you guys, some of the people that aren't here that you think should be. Okay, but let's get to it. Let's go through it. As you can see in the graphic here, I've got system architects, which are basically mobsters, highwaymen, old school, stick-up men, bank robbers, roadmen. Easy to downplay these guys, but a lot of them had a real, and women, they had a real effect on the way law enforcement did business. And then the Narco-Sovereigns, as I've got them listed there, the drug dealers, and the scale of which is huge. And I've cut that down to these 8, but definitely changed the way the whole world does law enforcement. And then the final group is a catch-all kind of modern insurgents. And there's kind of a bleed over, no pun intended, or yeah, maybe pun is intended, with some of this, but couldn't easily fit them into another bracket. And then I've seen them 1 through 8 with each one, and that is totally my opinion about the impact they had top to bottom, right? So, because somebody ends up at 8 doesn't mean that they didn't have influence. They are on this list to me because they had big influence at all. People, you'll notice here before I start, there are no serial killers on this board. I don't want this to be violence porn. I don't want it to be, I want this to be realistic as much as I can about the effect on society and law enforcement. Serial killers have an effect. They certainly have an effect on culture, right? Because movies, horror movies, documentarian films, books, serial killers really make up a lot of that story. They're fascinating for everybody to talk about. And when they are active, they are horrifying. But the truth is, in law enforcement, they don't really make up that big a number of victims. One, not to denigrate the victims or the victims' families. It is horrifying when they are working, but they just don't blip the radar as compared to the effect that a lot of these people had. In my opinion, you might disagree, and I want to hear that. Serial killers are what they are. I've interviewed a couple. It's just, I don't know. This is a different subject matter, in my opinion. So with that, let's get started. Let's get through round one, and then we will hear what you guys have to say, and we'll move on from there. So let's kick it off with the system architects. The 1 seed, Tony Accardo, I got him against the 8 seed, which is John Gotti. You know, a lot of people are going to say, wow, John Gotti, everybody knows John Gotti. How does that play out? How does he end up as an 8 seed? Well, I mean, you know, Gotti was a loud guy who was out there, made a lot of noise in a fairly short amount of time, was kind of the architect of his own demise. I've talked about Accardo a little bit. A lot of people don't even know Tony Accardo's name unless you kind of are a historian crime fan, Chicago person, which to me is what makes him more difficult as a law enforcement officer, as a detective, to try and deal with. So in this battle between Tony Accardo and John Gotti and who moves on in terms of the way law enforcement does business, pretty easy for me to pick Tony Accardo on that. Gotti was a lightning bolt of a criminal, but his own ego made it easier for us to do our job. Not easy. He did have that Teflon reputation, and it made it very difficult to get him prosecuted. Ultimately, it took flipping his own men to do it, but he got caught. So Tony Accardo moves on in that. The next one is Lucky Luciano, who's kind of an obvious pick. A lot of people, historians, will say he should be the number one guy. He created the 5 families. He organized the mafia into a cohesive 5 families type of unit, widely influential against a guy who I put in here and will be probably controversial, but I'll explain why, and that's Sonny Franzese. The reason I put Sonny Franzese in here is because he lived to be 103 years old. Now, he did a lot of time in prison, more than 30 years in prison, but living to be 103 years old and dying a free man, he was part of that system for a long time. But beyond that, and we can argue this point, but I would argue that Sonny Franzese is the last of the old time gangsters, real gangsters who didn't flip, wouldn't talk to law enforcement, wouldn't give law enforcement time of day in terms of giving anybody up. It's never going to happen. He did his time. He was an old school mobster, had a bit of flash to him. There's the talk of him potentially being involved with Marilyn Monroe. He was certainly a darling of the New York press back in the day. So he kind of even predated, well, certainly Gotti, but even Momo Giancana here in Chicago, who got himself in quite a bit of trouble being out front all the time in the media, feeding his own ego. Franzese wasn't about his ego so much as he was just a guy that people were drawn to. And he stuck to his guns all those years. And the fact that, now his son is out there, his son was a mobster himself and has become very popular in social media and, talks about his father a lot, which has kind of brought Sonny's name back out there, and he'd kind of been forgotten about for what he was. So to me, he's a real problem for law enforcement, and certainly he was a haunted man to the point where, that case that he did a long time for maybe was not the strongest thing and certainly not the worst thing he did in his career. But back to it, I mean, he seeded poorly in that regard because against Lucky Luciano, there's not much of a discussion there. Like Accardo and Gotti, Lucky Luciano is going to take this and move on because of the influence that he had on organized crime and how hard he made not just law enforcement's job, but the whole culture of this country may have been changed by his work. The next group is Frank Costello and Al Capone. Another tough one, but again, here we are back to a guy who lasted a long time in Frank Costello and had wide influence versus a guy who burned very brightly and was very well known. Al Capone is known to this day. His name is like synonymous with crime in Chicago. There are rappers 18, 19 years old that, bring up Al Capone's name. I think, I'm going down to the wire with this. I originally was in the mindset of like Accardo and Gotti with this. And Frank Costello, a little bit lost to history, but if you know organized crime, you know him well. I don't want to be stuck in going with the Chicago guys all the time. So though my initial inclination was to go with Frank Costello in this, I'm changing late in the game here, and I just think Al Capone's was such a problem. Not so much in the time he got himself caught. People say, they never get him for any of the murders he did or St. Valentine's Day massacre, which he certainly probably organized and all of that. They got him for tax evasion. Yeah, well, they got him, and his ego got him, right? But because of his cultural influence and the way he was glorified as a criminal, I'm going to move him on here over Frank Costello. And that leaves the final bracket, 4 and 5 seeds, Meyer Lansky and Santo Trafficante Jr. Meyer Lansky was the financial brains of organized crime throughout the country. We had Murray, the Camel Humphreys here in Chicago, was a similar type of guy, a much smaller scale, money guy, very smart with handling money. But Meyer Lansky was the man when it came to finances. And you could argue that without Lansky, the mafia fizzles out much faster in this country, because Lansky was behind the deals, pushed Bugsy Siegel out. But Siegel's a guy that could have ended up on this list, but to start Vegas, the casinos in Cuba, he started moving their money into more legitimate things. He thought more big picture. I think all of that influence that the New York City mob had in the unions and the building trades and the garbage trade in New York City and in Chicago, the influence in the casinos in Vegas later on, and the union funds and raiding those funds, all that probably can be traced back to Meyer Lansky's genius in handling money. Santo Trafficante, though, he's a 5 seed for a reason. He was around for a long time, shadowy figure who very, very almost certainly was big worked with the CIA. I think that's documented now, to try and influence what was going on in Cuba, probably the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Santo Trafficante's name often comes up in the JFK investigation, assassination, although I've never seen anything that ties it to him directly. But one thing's for sure, it didn't matter if you're Tony Accardo or Lucky Luciano or Meyer Lansky. If it happened in the South, in Louisiana, Florida, it went through Santo Trafficante. He had an immense amount of control. Powerful criminal who caused law enforcement all kinds of headaches. But you got to go with Meyer Lansky here, right? He changed the scope and breadth of the way the mafia worked in this country. So he's moving on. So next brackets are going to be in this, Tony Accardo versus Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano versus Al Capone. So chew on that. Let me know your thoughts. The next group, the Highwaymen. John Dillinger versus Pretty Boy Floyd. Very similar criminals in that they were Depression-era gangsters who robbed banks, shot people up, shot up with law enforcement. They used the lack of technology at the time and the inability of police departments to communicate across borders, across jurisdictions, to really do a lot of damage. This is an easy one for me because John Dillinger was the man in that. Pretty Boy Floyd was a more regional, kind of Oklahoma-based guy that had his name made him more well-known than his actual influence. John Dillinger, on the other hand, you could argue, created the modern FBI. Now, that was really J. Edgar Hoover, who was a savvy politician and knew how to get what he wanted, often through some pretty nefarious activities. But He saw the opportunity there to go from having his agents and his agency be largely clerical to being trained law enforcement officers. He made the 10 most wanted list. He made Dillinger #1 to start. He made him famous. And John Dillinger helped him out by being very organized. He learned how to rob banks when he went to prison as a very young man by a guy who taught him to train, to work for it, to practice these robberies, to be on a clock, to be a timer, to get in and out, to know when a policeman were working and how big the police department was, how big the bank was. He was very organized. Where some of these people who are here, I'll get to, like Bonnie and Clyde, biggest take they may have taken was maybe $2,500. Dillinger, in a time of the Depression where money was tight for everybody, hit banks for $40,000, $60,000, $90,000. He was a professional criminal. He was also a thug and a killer, but he made law enforcement change the way they did business. So easy pick there. Dillinger's moving on. The next one is Babyface Nelson and Bonnie and Clyde, who I mentioned, the 2 and 7 seed here. So neither one of these people, or these groups of people here, are among my favorites to talk about. Historically, they're just, their names are a whole lot more than they were. Although both Babyface Nelson and Bonnie and Clyde, extremely violent. Bonnie and Clyde were basically thrill-seeking thugs who were off their rocker and were killers. They got a reputation a little bit because of the Depression as being like cheering for the underdogs, but that was part of the culture then. Banks were repossessing houses at a frightening rate. People were losing their farms. The establishment was the enemy. And so people like Bonnie and Clyde and Dillinger and these people were romanticized because they seemed to just not care and flying against the system. In truth, Bonnie and Clyde were covered a lot of territory, which made them very difficult to catch in that short time period that they were there. Frank Hamer did catch up to them, the lawman out of Texas Ranger, and put an end to him, very violent end to him. But the scores they took down were minimal. Their name was much bigger than what they were, in my opinion. Babyface Nelson, on the other hand, was a straight killer. He lived for the violence. He did take some big scores. He worked with Dillinger's gang for a while, but even Dillinger's like, this guy is off his rocker. Babyface was not the thing he called him to his face. He didn't like that. But he would shoot it out. He would look for shootouts, and he loved to shoot it out with policemen. Ultimately, he was killed after he killed 2 FBI agents in a wild shootout in Barrington, Illinois. I'm moving Babyface Nelson on. Extremely violent, and that type of guy, he made law enforcement stand on end. Now, I'll get a lot of pushback from this, and I can see it because Bonnie and Clyde's reputation, especially after Arthur Penn made the really good movie. You guys tell me. I'll know by the time I get off this. Maybe, but I'm moving Babyface Nelson on. Next one, a little more interesting, is Jesse James, the younger gang, versus Alan Karpus and the Barkers, Ma Barker and that gang. So they're seated 3 and 6. Jesse James, Cole Younger, Frank James, and the Younger brothers. They were post-Civil War bandits who really changed the way everybody did business and looked at criminals. Again, they were very romanticized. They're from Missouri. They're very difficult to get to because people in Missouri thought of them as their boys and wouldn't cooperate with law enforcement in any way. Finally, they robbed so many banks that they did rob banks, but they robbed so many trains that the train companies hired the Pinkerton agency to go looking for them. And it took them a long time, and they never really were successful with tracking down the James Younger gang. The Great Northfield Raid, as it was called, in Northfield, Minnesota, they decided to rob a bank up there, and somehow I got word that they were coming, and they had a lot of policemen and civilians there standing by, and that shootout pretty much devastated. I think Frank James was shot 5 or 6 times. I think Cole Younger may have been shot 11 times. They all survived, but that really beat him up and separated him. And then, of course, Jesse James was killed by one of his own gang members. They never really were dealt with by law enforcement to a finality, where it's not quite true with the Barker Karpus gang. Alvin, they were Depression era gangsters as well. They were perfected the art of kidnapping wealthy people, holding them for ransom. There wasn't a lot of violence with that. I mean, not that they weren't violent. They were. They would shoot it out with law enforcement whenever it's necessary. But Karpus was a pretty sharp guy, pretty mean dude. The Mob Barker got quite a reputation. There's a lot of talk around that about how much he was actually involved. I think the Barkers were killed in a big shootout in Florida, but with the FBI. Mob Barker was killed, and there's always been some discussion that her legend was pushed by J. Edgar after she was killed, but it's hard to tell. She was definitely at least supportive of her boys. Alvin Karpus was caught himself, did some time, ended up in Spain or Italy or something, died an old man. Really interesting crew that gave law enforcement fits. But in this heads up here, I'm going with Jesse James and the Youngers because they really made criminals kind of a household name. So James Younger gang, moving on. The last two, fairly interesting, one really well known, one less. That's Charles Starkweather, and Billy the Kid, William H. Bonney. William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid is a household name. Like Dillinger, like Al Capone, very few people have not heard of Billy the Kid. Movies, books, songs, everybody knows some accounting of Billy the Kid. Charles Starkweather, on the other hand, unless you're a real crime historian, you may not know who Charlie Starkweather was. But you'll know of him because Bruce Springsteen wrote the song Nebraska, and the tone of that album was based a lot on the life of Charles Starkweather. Billy Joel allegedly wrote the song We Didn't Start the Fire about Charlie Starkweather. The movie Badlands with Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek from one of those great 70s crime films based almost really directly on Charlie Starkweather. The more modern films, Natural Born Killers and California with Brad Pitt, were based on Charlie Starkweather. Charlie Starkweather was the guy who, kind of out of boredom, if nothing else, and also something wrong in his brain, grabs a young girl, befriends her, and in a Bonnie and Clyde style goes on a spree killing. Yeah, they did a little robbing, but that wasn't the point. It was just out to not be bored and be violent. And for the short time he was out there, before he got caught, he was a living terror. So Billy the Kid's reputation is huge, but what's really known about his crimes is not that great. I think my father probably knows more about Billy the Kid than Billy the Kid knew about himself. My dad is an Old West historian buff, and he's already telling me what I got wrong about the James and Youngers, I could promise you. But I think he would be the first to say that Billy the Kid's reputation far exceeded what he actually did in this life. And as far as law enforcement and his effect on law enforcement, I mean, there were so many guys out. The West was the Wild West for a reason. And there's a lot of those type of guys. His name just kind of got to the forefront, like, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp and some of these other guys that and Wyatt Earp was known more as a lawman, but always kind of on the edge of that. It might surprise you that I think Charlie Starkweather had a lot more influence on the way law enforcement does business, because that idea of the spree killer thankfully doesn't come along very often, but when it does, like the DC sniper, when that happens, it terrifies communities, right? Because it's not like, it's even different than the mass shooter who walks into a school or a church or a gathering and starts shooting people. That's terrifying, everybody's worst nightmare, but it's over pretty quickly. Where guys like Starkweather, they'll go on for sometimes, a week, maybe more, and nobody knows where they're going to show up. Law enforcement in a wide swath is on edge, looking, never know where they're going to show up next. And so it really made us think about the way we do our job and how we're going to react to somebody like that. So Charlie Starkweather is moving on in that battle with Billy the Kid. So what we got moving on in this group is going to be John Dillinger versus Charlie Starkweather, and Babyface Nelson versus Jesse James and the younger group. Okay, so moving on to the Narcos, the Narco-Sovereigns. Pablo Escobar is your 1 seed, and Frank Lucas is your 8 seed. Frank Lucas, innovative, dangerous drug dealer, and went to Asia to set up his own supply line of heroin. Used soldiers coming back from Vietnam and put drugs in the casket to get them back to bypass customs. Was in New York City at the time. He was the heroin kingpin. So if you're a copper working that area, he was your focus, and you didn't really give a damn about Pablo Escobar. But in this battle, there's no real argument, right? Pablo Escobar corrupted an entire country. He changed very negatively the world in terms of what was going on with drugs and drug sales. He was partially behind it with the other, criminal drug groups there in Colombia, but he was the man. He was the forefront, the first multi-billionaire criminal that people talked about. So he's moving on, sure. The next group is, now this will be a little controversial, I suppose, because people are going to say, wait, how is Chapo Guzman not in this spot? It is Ismael Zambada Garcia El Mayo. He is here to me because to me, and this is my opinion, there are people that know this better than me and jump in and give me all the shit you want, but he was to El Chapo what Tony Accardo was to Momo Giancana. He was the brains, the quiet structure behind the power. He was there for years until recently. He ends up on a plane in El Paso, is taken in custody. There's a lot of whole conversation with that, how that happens. But up until that point, El Mayo was largely unknown, and the power structure behind the Sinaloa cartel, which was $1 billion. And so he is there instead of El Chapo, as he should be, in my opinion. He is up against Freeway Ricky Ross. And if you're from the West Coast, you're going to know about Ricky Ross. And even if you're not, here's what you should know. When the crack epidemic hit the United States in the mid-'80s, early 90s, it devastated our poor African-American inner city neighborhoods, not just African-American, but boy, they paid a heavy price. It was like something we had never seen. And I got on the Chicago Police Department in the early 90s, and crack cocaine was slower to come to Chicago than other places because our gangs are so entrenched here. They just were not going to let it in until they could figure out how to control it themselves. And once they did, it hit like wildfire. And our murders, like everywhere else, went crazy. Cities like Baltimore, New York City, Los Angeles, pick one, right? The crack cocaine epidemic brought a level of violence that was before unseen. And nobody was more adept at getting crack cocaine out there and figuring out that structure and how to move it than Ricky Ross was. Called him Freeway for a reason, because every freeway across the country, he figured out how to move it and get it there. He turned that into a nearly $1 billion operation. But once again, you're talking about kind of regional versus global. And in this confrontation here, I'm going with El Mayo because of that incredible power base they had and the influence they had in Sinaloa, which El Chapo was part of, right, and a household name. So El Mayo's moving on in that. The next one, not another regional versus big scale, not really fair, probably, but that's the way seating works, and that is Miguel Felix Gallardo. It's actually Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo versus Griselda Blanco. I'll get to Miguel in a moment, but Griselda Blanco, in a space and time, was an incredible pain in the ass for law enforcement. The city of Miami, which kind of everybody knows now, but TV shows like Miami Vice, documentaries like Cocaine Cowboys, and that Miami went virtually overnight in the late 70s from being a sleepy kind of resort East Coast getaway town to the murder capital of the United States. I mean, literally, like 70 murders on average for several years to 1,500 murders at its peak. But there was a lot that went into that. But Griselda Blanco was extremely violent and used violence and her guile to create a group of criminals that caused much of that havoc and was public enemy number one down there among those drug dealers. She had a powerful influence on the way law enforcement and law enforcement in South Florida and narcotics enforcement across the country did business. So that's how she gets on this. But once again, regional versus global. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, he was the man who organized the cartels into a cohesive group, a little bit like the Lucky Luciano of the Mexican cartels. He was incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, and incredibly influential in the drug trade and the corruption of the Mexican law enforcement system, judicial system, political system. You could easily make the argument that he is seated too low here, and he's up there with Escobar in terms of influence, bad influence. Just didn't quite, or he doesn't have the notoriety of Escobar. So again, easy one here. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo is moving on, and that leaves our two final in the Narcos, and that's Kunsa and Bumpy Johnson. Again, here we're back to this kind of regional versus international thing. Bumpy Johnson was infamous and powerful drug dealer, the godfather of Harlem, the guy who really made African-American organized crime a thing in New York City. He was all powerful. He would deal on an even level with the Italian mafia there. He had his own drug supply. Once again, if you're a copper working in New York City and Harlem at that time, nobody else's name meant anything to you. And he set up an incredible power structure that Frank Lucas kind of inherited, took over with Bumpy's death. Very influential criminal. But if you don't know the name Kunsa, then I'll tell you about him briefly. He was the mastermind of the Golden Triangle there in Asia. He was a man who was a government sovereignty to himself. No government controlled him. He had an army of somewhere between 20 and 50,000 soldiers himself. You did not move heroin, opium in the world without Kunsa having some influence over it. And he was untouchable. You just couldn't get to him because he's up there in the remote jungles with his own army and was free to do as he acted as government, pretty much. So in this one, Kunsa takes that just because of his global influence. So next coming up for you guys to chew on is going to be Pablo Escobar versus Kunsa and El Mayo Garcia versus Miguel Felix Gallardo. Those are two really interesting brackets. It'll be interesting to hear from you on. And finally, the last one, the modern insurgents. Hard to fit these guys in, and everybody on here is a bad guy or bad person, criminal. The only exception may be my 8 seed here, Frank Abagnale, who at the end of his life, con man extraordinaire. Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks made a movie about him, Catch Me If You Can. The guy was a con man extraordinaire, even as a young kid, flying planes and acting as a doctor when he could do neither. The reason I'm coming off him a little bit is he, late in his life, he worked with law enforcement, and to show us basically how he did those scams and how people do these scams. He worked with corporations to teach them how they were going to be beaten with scams. So he kind of resurrected himself later in his life. But But he is up against the number one seed, Larry Hoover, who was just recently let out of prison by President Trump. Not quite sure of that deal, but you can figure that out and let me know. Larry Hoover was a bad man. He was if not the founder, he was certainly the power broker behind the Gangster Disciples, which was the biggest gang in Chicago by numbers, extremely powerful. And Larry Hoover, his real influence and power, oddly enough, came after he got locked up. He really showed us as law enforcement they can't sit on your heels because you have a bad guy arrested and put in jail. That doesn't end it. Larry Hoover controlled, probably even made more powerful, the Gangster Disciples while he was in prison. He had absolute control inside the prison systems, and he was controlling what was going on in the outside. I think he got convicted of more crimes and did more time for the things he did while he was in prison than the things he had done outside. Incredibly influential and dangerous guy that had massive negative influence on the city of Chicago and this country. So that's kind of an easy one there. Larry Hoover takes that one. The next one are two. One guy's fairly well known, the other not so much, and that is the 2 seed Barry the Baron Mills, and the 7 seed Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger is one of those guys that has become, part of American culture, pretty well known. His influence was very regional, but he taught us some ugly things about ourselves. He corrupted an FBI agent. He was himself an informant, not because he got caught, not because he was altruistic and wanted to change his ways. He basically volunteered as an informant to solidify his power base. And whatever information he gave to law enforcement, he was always trying to get more intelligence back to use against his rivals. He would beef on his rivals. He would get them locked up. He would have them killed based on information that he would barter and trade with law enforcement. He is an example, and I've talked about this on my podcast, and it is something as well-known law enforcement. Dealing with informants is a tricky business that you have to be on guard about all the time. And Whitey Bulger represents that as much as anybody. Now, Barry Mills, on the other hand, Baron, different altogether. He was the leader of the Aryan Nation, a white supremacist group in prison that became very powerful, almost all powerful inside of federal prison systems. And Barry Mills called a lot of those shots over the years. A lot of people died, a lot of powerful control inside and outside of the prison systems on a national scale. The fact that he is not widely known tells you a lot about the man. I mean, first of all, he's in prison for most of that time, but they're extremely violent, scary group of people, controlled a lot of the drug trade inside and outside of the prison system. Because of that, I'm taking Barry Mills in this over Whitey Bulger, simply because Bulger's influence was very regional in the Boston area. So Barry Mills is moving on there. So we're getting here to our last 4. The next group, Bernie Madoff versus Jeff Fort. This is one of the ones that I struggle with the most. Bernie Madoff taught us quite a bit in law enforcement and about ourselves as a culture, right? Bernie Madoff didn't create the Ponzi scheme, but he perfected it and made it devastating. Bernie Madoff was one of the most trusted investment advisors in the United States. He had among the most wealthy people in the country, movie stars, celebrities, all knocking his door down for his services because he was always showing big turnarounds on investments, consistently high numbers, to the point where really people inside of the system, people in the know, real investment people and traders knew something was up with him for years. Like, this can't be that he is continuing to do this. But nobody suspected that, that his scam was going into the maybe hundreds of millions. And it took law enforcement a long time to catch up to him. And he devastated a lot of lives, not just wealthy, entrepreneurs and celebrities, but working class union people whose Pension funds were devastated. A really, truly bad man who got the white collar kind of pass, but he died in prison as he should have. A truly bad man that on the scale of everybody else on this list, minus the violence, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have the devastating effect, right? Jeff Fort, on the other hand, was a Chicago gangbanger who went well beyond what our average gang member does here. He founded the El Rucan Nation, but for Jeff Fort, it was about control and violence to the point where he had communications with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and was trying to purchase, and except for ATF intervention, federal intervention, might have secured surface-to-air Stinger missiles and things. He had bad plans that he almost pulled off. Very dangerous guy. Still in prison to this day. I don't think he will get the pass that Larry Hoover got because of that kind of international terrorist kind of link. Tough call on this one, but I think the white-collar guys get too much of a pass, and switched on this twice already, but I'm going with Bernie Madoff moving on here because I don't like that those kind of guys get that pass, that it's easy to vilify a guy like Jeff Fort, and he deserved it, but Bernie Madoff, he did a lot of damage. So Bernie Madoff is moving on there. And the final two, which is a little bit more international intrigue, and one of them, whose name I'll try not to butcher, but Simeon Migojevic. I have just kind of come about knowing about him recently, and I'll get back to him in a second. He is the 4 seed. The 5 seed is Robert Hansen. A lot of people will have heard of Robert Hansen. He makes this list because of the damage that he did to this country. He was an FBI agent, Chicago-born guy, and he, I think he's a Northwestern grad. He gets in the FBI, and he is a counterintelligence expert. He ends up becoming a spy for the Russians, and he did that for years. The amount and the scope of information that he sold to the Russians, we probably will never quite have a grasp on the damage that did. But the story is crazy. I mean, he was in charge of units at different times that was looking for himself. Like, he was put in charge of a unit that was looking for the mole they knew was inside the FBI, and he was that mole. Is that a failure on the FBI's part? Yes, it is. But really, it goes to Hansen's real guile and evil ability to keep himself hidden. He just was a master criminal, bad guy, cloaked in law enforcement gear. In fact, I mean, when he got caught maybe out of greed, or maybe just because what happens, he goes to do one more dead drop, meaning, he leaves a note for his Russian handlers that, hey, and they know that wherever spot he's going to leave the classified material is going to be there. But by this time, his fellow agents were on him, and they grab him. And when they grab him, he basically said, "What took you guys so long?" I mean, like, just a bad guy. But he's up against Simeon Migojevic, who is an active world criminal who currently is on the FBI's most wanted list with a $5 million bounty on him. If you're a bounty hunter, good luck with that, because he has sovereign immunity in Russia. So basically, you ain't going into Russia and locking him up because they ain't going to allow it. He has immunity. Maybe you can buy off the Russians to turn them over to you, but then you're giving up most of your $5 million. But Migojevic, he is a world scale organized crime figure. And you name the crime: drug dealing, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, legit land purchases, control. He is a Bond villain, basically. He is not widely known here in this country, but to anybody who pays attention to world criminality, he is well known. Amazingly powerful criminal. So, boy, that's a tough one, but because I know a lot more about Hansen than I do Mogilevich. But based on what I have read and learned, old Simeon's moving on in this one. So next round, Larry Hoover versus Simeon Mogilevich, and Barry Mills versus Bernie Madoff. So there you have it. That's the layout. Let me know your thoughts. What did I miss? Who did I miss? Who would you have put in there? And most importantly, of that group, who's moving on? Let me know what you think. Get back to me. I appreciate it. Take care of yourself. Oh, I hope your bracket wins. Your real March Madness bracket wins. The Hoosiers are out, so I just went with what I thought best. Anyway, good luck. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Talk to you soon.